All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Blindspot. Isabella is in Spain. I am here in the U.S., untraveled and unsophisticated as always. I don't go anywhere. I stay right here. And today we have with us the wonderful, I'm going to say Mr. Ferguson, because I have a first question for you. I've read many of your books and watched many of your interviews over the years. And I've noticed that nobody knows whether your name is Neil or Nile, and you never correct them. So I thought I'd ask you that as a first question. Is it Neil or Niall Ferguson? It's the first question.
Well, it's Niall. It's Neil. I mean, the Gaelic name Neil can be spelt in any number of ways because spelling wasn't really one of the strong suits of the Scots back when they were doing a lot of migration. The Irish mispronounced the name Nile because they largely forgot Gaelic and then relearned it in an attempt to be good nationalists. And they relearned it with lots of pronunciation errors, of which Nile is one. And so if you say Nile, you're confusing me with the well-known Egyptian river. It's Nile. And if you go up to the northwest of Scotland, where they really say these things right, they say Niall, which sounds great. It's really a two-syllable name. And if you want the punchline, since you've started me off on this, I once sought the advice of the professor of Celtic languages at Oxford, who was a Welshman and therefore neutral
you weren't sure yourself.
In the dispute. And he ruled. No, I wanted a ruling from an expert. I mean, I'm just a Scotsman called Neil, and he ruled in favor of my pronunciation, Neil. And I explained this to an Irishman in a pub once, who listened to me carefully, sipped on his Guinness, and then said, but what about Brian? Because the diphthong IA in Ian is pronounced Ian, and in Brian is pronounced Brian. So perhaps everybody who's calling themselves Brian is in fact called Brian. I'll leave that to listeners.
Well, I've lost a lot of bets. I liked Nile better, so I've been saying that for years. And then all my friends told me it was Neil, and they told me I was wrong, and I bet them $10 it wasn't. But okay,
so we have a lot of. They call me Nigel
Ferguson. So we have,
and when people call me Nigel, I will correct them.
Yeah, the famed historian and sometimes biographer Niall Ferguson with us today. And once I learned recently, thought himself a comedian. So,
well, everybody in my day went to Oxford or Cambridge hoping to be the next Monty Python, and I was no exception. My plan on going to Oxford was to follow in the footsteps of the Python team or of the Beyond the Fringe team. The trouble is, being funny is really very difficult, and hardly anybody with that aspiration makes it. The exception in my experience is my former student, Sacha Baron Cohen, who did go from the Cambridge Footlights to global fame. But I realized I was actually not that funny after about 2 years of trying to cut it in Oxford amateur theatricals. And then I had the great insight that if I stuck to history and became an academic, then when I was funny, everybody would be so relieved that I was not boring that they would laugh quite a lot. So it's all about expectations. If you're expecting a comedian, your bar is very high. If you're expecting a historian, you'll laugh at practically anything you're already doing.
That's actually so you might even be a comedian today, but just one among historians. So that's clever. Well, let me give a little bit of introduction to Neil, and he can further introduce himself, I think. Neil's written many incredible books. The Ascent of Money is one of the first I ever read of his, and in my opinion, he has written the most important of the Kissinger biographies, which I think you say in the book yourself that you really weren't a biographer, but that he himself insisted that you write his biography. And maybe one of the neatest and most wonderful books on those individuals, such as the Rothschilds, the incredible conspiracy targets, which we love. Isabella believes run the world, and many others. So he's been writing for a very, very long time. Has many books out. I'm sure most of you know who he is. Neil, a portion of our audience is actually crypto people. So Neil has crypto's made an appearance in a number of his books as well. So I think we're probably going to be running the gamut today. Neil, you'd call yourself a historian, right?
Absolutely. That's all I do.
So
I quit the comedy stuff ages ago.
So he's a historian with an incredible depth of knowledge, and I am honored to have him on today. So we'll hit on tons of topics, tons of subjects, and I think that you guys are in for a treat, or maybe the.
No, I was just going to say thank you for having us, for coming on the show, and for timing our interview so well, because I think we organized this weeks ago, and it was almost, I don't know how you managed to predict this would be the exact moment Nancy Pelosi lands in Taiwan. So excellent timing on that front.
Well, I did write about it last week. Pretty confident that she would land in Taiwan, but I must confess that I wasn't scheduling her arrival to coincide with our recording. That it goes beyond the limits of my powers.
What was with the saber rattling, do you think?
Well, I think we've got some more saber rattling to look forward to. It's highly unlikely, in my view, that the Chinese will just sit back and watch Nancy Pelosi meeting the president of Taiwan. They have a playbook for this, which is quite well established. And so I should imagine that there will be quite a lot of flyovers by PLA jets, maybe a missile test here and there. There'll be a fair amount of military activity on the mainland coast. And all of this will be designed to signal highest disapproval on the part of the Chinese Communist Party for Nancy Pelosi's visit. I don't think there's about to be a war. So if you're selling your stocks in anticipation of the Cuban Missile Crisis, relax. I don't think that's very likely. But I think to me, the strange thing is that the Biden administration has been ramping up its rhetoric and its actions on Taiwan for some months now. What's strange about that is that from a Chinese vantage point, at some point in the relatively near future, and people debate about how near, they may well make a move. And this seems to me to encourage them to do that. What's strange is that we're not really in a position to do much about it if the Chinese launch a successful invasion of Taiwan. It's not 1996 when we could send 2 aircraft carrier groups and the Chinese would have to back off. They now have a capacity to sink American aircraft carriers with land-based missiles. And it's a pretty much open secret at the Pentagon that all the war games in recent years have ended in a Chinese victory whenever they've tried to play out a Taiwan invasion scenario. So it's a strange thing to want to bring to a boil, especially when you've got a war going on in Ukraine that is absorbing a considerable amount of American resources. So I'm struggling a bit to understand the logic behind this. The idea that Nancy Pelosi just made up her mind to do this without consulting anybody, I think we can probably dismiss.
Do you remember the last time she traveled? I don't recall another time where I've seen Nancy Pelosi going on like a European, like the Eva Peron rainbow tour. She's like all over Asia right now. Christian Dior.
But it's probably not. I mean, I'm sure she does a fair amount of this. After all, she's got her husband's portfolio to research and advise on. It's just that normally a trip by the Speaker of the House of Representatives isn't news, but when it's Taiwan, that is news. And just as it was news when Newt Gingrich did it back in 1997, going to Taiwan as an American official of any kind is regarded by the Chinese as a provocation, especially if you go and meet, as Nancy Pelosi is doing, the Taiwanese president, because it disrupts the strange fiction that Taiwan is in fact a province of China, the one China fiction. And it also, I think, calls into question the ambiguity of the American position, which is that we kind of accept that, but at the same time, under a 1979 Act of Congress, we reserve the right to take action if the Chinese try to change the status of Taiwan by force. So Taiwan is part of China officially and formally, but de facto it's an independent democracy and a very thriving and successful one. If you go around meeting with the president of Taiwan as if Taiwan's an independent country and ignoring Chinese disapproval, I think you implicitly call into question the one China policy, and that's what the Chinese don't like.
So I think we should. There's a couple things to hit on, but I'd like to talk a little bit about the foreign policy of the Biden administration and juxtapose that in some ways with like the foreign policy of the Trump administration. I apologize. What's interesting to me, like you wrote your book, Doomed, the most recent one, you're talking a little bit about the fact that we are in what you believe to be a Cold War with China, right?
That's
and
right.
This is something that was confirmed to you, in fact, at a conference by a Chinese a Chinese diplomat of some sort, who you. I mean, maybe the story from your mouth is better. I read it, but you can tell it better than I can retell it.
Well, I have been arguing that we're in Cold War II for quite a while. I think 4 years now. At the end of the book, Doom features a bunch of scenarios around the US-China conflict, including the possibility of a war over Taiwan. So this is looking good today. When I first made this argument in a lecture at a conference in Italy, I was scheduled to be followed by a Chinese official, one whom I knew quite well. I won't say who it was because what followed was a private conversation. And after I had made my, as I thought it, inflammatory and provocative talk about Cold War II and the US-China confrontation, he then stood up and spoke and made almost no reference to what I'd said. And I had actually expected him to contradict me and say that this was not at all the case and that China still was committed to a win-win relationship with the United States. And he didn't do that. And I said to him afterwards, I was surprised that you didn't take issue with what I said about Cold War II. And he smiled and said, no, well, that's because I agree with you. And then it dawned on me that it's actually been clear to the Chinese for quite a while that we're in a Cold War. It's just the US that's a bit slow to notice.
You write in Dune that he actually smirked and said it to you. And to me, I took this, and I think you explicitly stated that you sort of believe they started it. Like they know what they're doing. They knew exactly what they were doing.
I think Xi Jinping has embarked on a course that implied Cold War, even if it didn't explicitly intend it. And that was something I remember noticing 10 years ago when I made a documentary series for Channel 4 called China, Triumph and Turmoil. PBS declined to air it for reasons that I don't recall, but I looked at it the other day and it stands up quite well. The point that the series made was that the regime of Xi Jinping, which had just really come into existence, is a strange amalgam of the imperial, because vestiges of that certainly persist in the way the CCP runs itself, the Maoist, because there is a nostalgia for Mao in China that you encounter in many locations, and she plays to that and has revived Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism in the ideology of the CCP, and finally of a desire to emulate Western imperial power structures. And I would say One Belt, One Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative, is a part of a global expansion of Chinese power. And these things together 10 years ago were obviously putting China on course for some kind of friction with the United States. Even earlier than that, I wrote a piece with Moritz Schullerich about Chimerica. That was in 2007, and we argued that the Chinese-American economic fusion of that time was a chimera. The whole point of the word Chimerica was to have a pun on chimera, which, by the way, really doesn't work in Chinese. But we expected the U.S.-China relationship. No, it really doesn't work. So we.
No, it does. I'm thinking right now about my rudimentary Chinese knowledge, and I like. First of all, most of Chinese is written characters that have like literal meaning, and you can't really. There's like portmanteau doesn't work as well. It's not German. it's interesting.
Yeah, it just puns by and large don't export well into other languages. At any event, we expected the US-China relationship to unravel, and in a way it took longer than I expected, and it didn't really unravel in American minds, or begin unraveling in American minds, until Trump's election and the trade war that he then unleashed. But the trade war didn't become a Cold War until around about Mike Pence's speech to the Hudson Institute in October of 2018. And that was around about the time that I started explaining to people that even if you just looked at a map of the world according to Huawei, it looked like a Cold War map, because there were the countries that adopted Huawei and the countries that banned Huawei and the non-aligned countries that couldn't make up their minds because, hey, it looks really cheap. But on the other hand, the Chinese control it. So the idea of Cold War had been in my mind for a while, but it had not been at all accepted in Western discussion. And when I first brought it up in the polite salons of California, I was told I was a very naughty boy and shouldn't talk about Cold War because we actually were going to have co-opetition with the Chinese. And I remember saying, co-opetition isn't a word for a reason. Anyway, the Chinese, I think, saw this long before people in the West.
So this was this concept of co-opetition that was like Eric Schmidt and a bunch of like really, and I kind of wanted to get into this. I'm glad you brought it up, because what's interesting to me, I've noticed this in both the Kissinger book and this book as well, is that foreign policy seems to be done by relatively small groups of people. It seems like there's like, if you're in the in crowd, you see like Mike Pence at the Hudson Bay Institutes and its obvious consequences, his speech, right? And if you're not, then like something like that, like that'll be written in a history book in 20 years. And you'll be like, wow, well, everyone must have known about that. But the reality is that it seems to kind of happen behind closed doors and is obvious to everybody who's involved, but not at all to the people that it affects, like us, right? And I think, so to change gears and talk a little bit about the Donald Trump administration, it seemed to me that Trump very much felt and acted like an outsider of foreign policy as well, and sort of did what just like, I don't know, an American would do or something like that if they like took the reins of the presidency. And it felt like that, I think, for United States citizens. My God, for United States citizens, as we watched him try to like navigate those waters that, you know, he's not a foreign policy, he's just like a business guy. He's kind of just doing like businessy things as he did foreign policy. To that, do you want to read the quote Donald Trump that you have here, Isabella, regarding Ukraine? Not to change the subject to Ukraine necessarily, but I think it's relevant.
Well, the quote is the quote from. It's from Neil's latest column. So he starts the whole piece off like asking us, the reader, like, who said this? And the quote goes, "It's like they're afraid of him," Trump said, referring to Putin. "You know, he was a friend of mine. I got along great with him." I can't do the mannerisms. I say, Vladimir, if you do it, I attack Ukraine, we're hitting Moscow. And he sort of believed me like 5%, 10%. That's all you need. He never did it during my time, John. Why didn't he do this during the last 4 years? She didn't bother me either. I told him the same thing. And then Trump added, Taiwan will be next. You won't have any computer chips. They'll blow them off the face of the earth. Horrific rendition. Sorry about that, but that's the quote.
That's actually, I heard Trump say it, and that's exactly what he sounded like when he said it. So uncanny, Isabella.
Oh yeah.
The
Would never
be the way it goes.
But yeah, amazing. What I was just going to say is that I was very impressed. Not impressed. I think that's the wrong word, but that you put that at the front of your column, and it's provocative. It's also, I wonder what the reaction has been to your column pointing that out.
Taiwan will be next. You won't have any computer chips. They'll blow them off the face of the earth.
It's an English joke.
I wonder how many people recognized the quotation. Not many, I'd guess, but actually that extraordinary conversation that Trump had with a golfer. I don't play golf, so I didn't recollect his name, but the conversation was a really interesting one, because in it Trump asserted that he had said to Putin, if you invade Ukraine, I'll bomb Moscow. And he also asserted that he'd said something similar to Xi Jinping, presumably on the subject of Taiwan. And of course, as an historian, I'm trained to disbelieve any claim of that sort. And we don't have any corroboration that he said those things. It's not like Putin or Xi have acknowledged it, nor are they likely to. But I asked somebody who was in the Trump administration, is there any plausibility to Trump's having said those things? And he replied, he said shit like that all the time. So I'm rather inclined to believe that Trump said something along those lines. Because...
And Neil, you'd be right to believe it was along those lines, because if you don't know who John Daly is, he should be your next biography. He's the most interesting golfer who's ever lived. He's like 350 pounds. During every single PGA Tour, there's a drinking, there's an alcohol consumption and cigarette consumption meter that people do. He got kicked out of the tour for uncouth behavior when he was young. Out of the PGA Tour, and so he went to the European Tour, and the first competition he played there, this is like when he was in his 20s, was at St. Andrews, the old course, and he immediately won. He's uncouth, he's a redneck, and he doesn't care. So
I'm
he was probably
Scotsman.
drunk. Yeah.
I'm the one Scotsman who really doesn't like golf, although the drinking and smoking.
Oh, Daly's wonderful. Daly's the most wonderful thing that ever happened. But he would have been drunk when Trump said this, I'm sure, because he always was. He's a diabetic, like, big guy. Like,
I think Neil frozen. All right, he's back. Good.
I think the important point about this conversation with Daly is that Trump's probably right that the war in Ukraine wouldn't have happened if he'd been re-elected. And I think he's right that we wouldn't be on the brink of another Taiwan Strait crisis. And the reason I say that is not that I'm an avid MAGA supporter. I was always deeply ambivalent about Trump and would be pretty dismayed if he were to be re-elected. But the reason I say it is that if one looks at the content of Trump's foreign policy, going back to your original question, and then at the kind of outcomes or the practice of Trump's foreign policy, it really was much more successful than the average foreign policy expert would like to admit. Trump was not a content-free proposition. Trump had a very clear critique of the mainstream foreign policy strategy of the United States. He wanted to abandon free trade in favor of protectionism, which was a radical reversal from a bipartisan consensus on free trade going back to the 1940s. He wanted to restrict immigration And he wanted to go after China on the, I think, legitimate ground that China was not playing by the rules of the World Trade Organization anyway. And this critique, I think, had a powerful appeal to American voters who felt, I think, rightly disconnected from the foreign policy establishment that had been so in favor of globalization, of free trade, free migration, free capital flows. And I think that was one very major reason why Trump got elected. And it's worth following through what then happened. I don't think tariffs were ever likely to reduce the US-China bilateral trade deficit. That never seemed terribly probable. But what I think Trump did was to waken Americans up to the Chinese challenge, not just the economic challenge, but the broader challenge, and to change the minds of the foreign policy establishment. And this was the remarkable thing, that it took Donald Trump to alert Americans to the fact that the Chinese economy was about to overtake them, indeed, by one measure, already had overtaken in terms of gross domestic product by 2014, and that this was not a good thing that the United States should continue to encourage. So this is, I think, the historical significance of Trump. Trump also, because he was the madman theory personified, Richard Nixon's old theory that you had to kind of seem crazy enough to deter the foreigners. I mean, Trump was far better at that than Nixon, because everybody knew that Nixon was basically a cold, calculating political machine. But Trump was far from cold and calculating. And when Trump talked about fire and fury, it was plausible.
Yeah, no, I agree, and that's it. It does kind of confirm that Nixon had the theory right, just the wrong person in the job for executing it. Right. I do find it interesting though. Like, why would you be dismayed if you were reelected rather than ambivalent or curious about what might happen next?
Ambivalence is, I think, appropriate. There were many aspects of the Trump administration that were, in fact, highly effective. The administration not only stood up to China, changed the national security strategy on that issue profoundly. I think it also avoided getting mixed up in wars, which kind of made a change. And I think more broadly, its economic policies were highly successful and delivered full employment without inflation, which is something we all now feel rather nostalgic about. So the Trump administration had many features that were, in fact, by the comparison with other recent administrations, admirable. The problem, of course, was Trump himself, his almost complete indifference to constitutional and indeed legal proprieties. And the culmination of this was his doomed attempt to overturn the election results, which I think rules him, or should rule him, out of any future candidacy for the presidency. In that sense, my views are quite conventionally those of a member of the global elite. But I actually think it's not healthy for the American Republic to contemplate re-electing a man who so obviously wanted to do a violence to the Constitution.
Who told you to think that? Who told you to think that?
I can't really blame anybody. I may even have arrived at this view on my own. It's always possible.
After or before Davos?
Well, I didn't go to Davos this year, so it can't have been Davos.
You were on the Zoom calls. I think I would. I know we only have a limited amount of time, right? So there's all sorts of subjects that we'd love to hit on. I think the Trump views are really interesting because you're one of the few academics, I think, who isn't deranged about him, and you seem fairly reasonable, which is why I asked about the ambivalence, because to me, like, I think sort of ambivalence is much more appropriate than like anger and belief that the American experiment is about to die if Trump is reelected. And I thought that maybe you might be the only academic who would find that question, or actually have an interesting answer for that question. But
just worth pointing out that Josh says that as a Floridian. He's entrenched in the Mar-a-Lago perspective.
But Josh in Florida, Republicans would rather it was Ron DeSantis who was the nominee in 2024.
Those people are stupid because if we give Ron DeSantis to the nation, then we don't get him ourselves, right? And the choices down here are sparse. We have a lot of people running around.
Well, I think you should make Trump governor of Florida and DeSantis president. That seems like the.
I'm all for that. I'm all for that. I'm all for that, Neil. I just, when we split away from America and we become Florerica, I just want to make sure that a good conservative man is sitting there at the top.
So Florida's going to be the new Taiwan of America, is what you're suggesting?
No. It's not going to be just us. It's going to be us, Louisiana, and Texas. Okay. And then what we're going to do is immediately form a coalition, meet up at the border, and take Georgia because we need some of the shipyards.
Right. Well, bringing a European perspective.
This is the quadrat demonstrandum moment. You see, this is why I'm ambivalent, because in many ways Trump represented a return to 19th century American politics, and many commentators didn't understand that because they don't actually know any 19th century history. Hence all the crazy analogies with Mussolini and Hitler and terrible books like Timothy Snyder's book on tyranny. No, Trump was a return to the incredibly hardball politics of the 19th century. But the problem with hardball politics in the 19th century was that it did produce a civil war. And I'm kind of one of those conventionally minded people who's against civil wars and doesn't want the United States to break up. And so one of the reasons that I'm ambivalent about Trump is that he had, I think, implicitly a serious threat to the constitutional stability of the republic. From a historian's point of view, the republic is an inherently unstable political institution. They generally don't last terribly long before tyranny supervenes because the plebs decide that the elites are corrupt. And I just don't want to see that play out in my lifetime. I'm a newly minted American citizen. I became a citizen in 2018. I don't want to show up in time for the darn Civil War, like one of those unfortunate.
Oh, you got here, Neil. You got here. Are you you're in Boston, right? Is that right? Up in Boston?
No. I normally am in the People's Republic of California.
California. That's the best state. That's the best worst state. We got to get you to a state where you can get some guns. But I've been thinking about this.
Don't worry, I hang out in Montana quite a bit of the.
There you go. So that's where you can put the
recharge my.
I've been, I mean, and this is what's interesting about, like, I think you talk about that in Doomed quite a bit, is that he's not Mao, he's not like Stalin. You have a whole section about sort of how it is sort of, and I picked this up because I don't think that you like necessarily say it explicitly, but you talk a little bit about how like the comparisons to Mao are not exactly where you should put Trump. And I think that's, very true. But what was interesting to me was I think I saw this coming when Occupy Wall Street happened. I said to a friend of mine when Occupy happened, I said, I think given that I'm hearing the rhetoric of these people say like, eat the rich, kill the rich, stuff like that. I said, I think we're probably 15 years away from like fighting in the streets. And Trump seemed to not even accelerate it, just to kind of like pull the cover off what I thought was already there. The accelerationism of sort of left-leaning ideals, very weird. I mean, the destruction of history. I actually wanted to hit on this. You talk about iconoclasm and the destruction. I mean, this is actually the segment that I'm talking about, where you kind of show it back to like history. The iconoclasm of America, where we're pulling down statues. And in the book, you just say that like, this has happened before in like other places, and you don't really like give any in-depth account of where. I thought maybe that'd be really interesting, is hearing about where in history this like ripping down of history, this ripping down of statues has happened, where it didn't result in like Maoist struggle sessions and such. Like, where has this occurred previous? Because you seem to kind of skip over the Mao portion of doing that and go right to like, it's happened in the UK and it's happened here and other places where they were just fine.
Well, I could have written a great deal more about iconoclasm if space had permitted. It has a long history, not only in the history of Christianity. Iconoclasm, for example, featured in the Reformation, where zealous Protestants tore down images of the Virgin Mary, whitewashed frescoes in churches. But it's not only a Christian phenomenon. In the Taiping rebellion, there was iconoclasm. And Mao's Cultural Revolution is a famous recent example that you've already alluded to. If you read Frank de Kutter's account of the Cultural Revolution, the war on the various different aspects of China's traditional culture extended to iconoclasm, as well, of course, as to physical violence against people who seemed in some way to personify the old order. But it's actually a quite recurrent feature in human history. The Russian Revolution had its iconoclastic phase. People tend to forget that, but in Richard Pipes's great history of the Bolshevik Revolution, he notes the massive destruction of churches and monasteries that went on in the early phase of the revolution. So I don't have a great enthusiasm for the tearing down of statues. Very often, historically, it's associated with violence against real people as well as stone effigies of people.
I mean, as a poll, I always think about, the fall of communism and how the first thing lots of former communist states did was tear down all the iconic communist statues and, Stalin's and all that sort of stuff.
Well, America and Iraq, right? Like that, we tore down, the first thing we did is we tore down the Saddam Hussein statue. It's very common. It's interesting.
And I think that sort of episode in the kind of post-communist sense, I'd argue with my Polish relatives, is that if that's okay, isn't other stuff okay? And they would usually come back to me saying, well, the difference is this is about oppression in our lifetime. So it's within the memory of everyone living. And that's why it's justifiable. Whereas tearing down statues from like 200, 300 years ago, not in anyone's lifetime. Just wondering what you think, how that juxtaposes with the kind of more history-laden tearing down that's going on, especially now. I think that's also the case in the UK. We've had a few statues toppled there as well.
Well, one can, of course, understand why many southern cities have seen statues of Confederate war heroes torn down. Many of those statues were built quite some time after the Civil War, and it's generally argued that they were built to emphasize the persistence of white supremacy in the southern states. But here's the point. It's not why you remove a statue, it's how you do it that matters. Obviously, we wouldn't want there still to be statues of Adolf Hitler in Berlin. The critical issue really is the process. I think if statues are torn down in an anarchic way by a mob, rather than removed by a democratic process, that's the dangerous thing. We don't have some kind of rule that says once a statue's up, it stays up. That would be absurd. But I think what was disturbing about much that happened in 2020 on both sides of the Atlantic was the lawless way in which it was done. By all means, debate about whether a statue should remain, but don't tear it down at the behest of a mob.
It wouldn't be iconoclasm if it weren't by the mob, right? Like that's
statue
kind of
removal. Yeah, but that's the point. If you don't like a statue, then your local council should take a decision. But tearing it down, which, as you rightly say, is what iconoclasm really implies, in a violent way, is nearly always associated with violence against real people. And I think it's as a believer in private property rights and democratic norms, I'm in favor of doing these things in an orderly way, and or not at all.
It is interesting because we do have curative mechanisms in democracy or in this republic, and it's interesting that the iconoclasm is a sort of bypassing of it, and also how few people are needed in an iconoclastic movement to really go and destroy that history. Because, like, you don't need 50% of your city to go and take down the Columbus statue. You need 10 people. You know what I mean? Also, Neil, just wanted to correct you. I heard you call it the Civil War. I think you meant the War of Northern Aggression. as we
Well,
regularly.
I'm sure if I'd been around, if I'd been around in the 19th century, I would have recognised it as a war caused by the secession of the southern states, and I would have, I'm sure, sided with the Union. But let's leave that debate for another podcast. Good Old Boys podcast, which I'm sure you feature on regularly.
I think Josh is, his inclination to be provocative, I should have warned you about. But moving back to Europe, though, because I'm quite interested in your views about the sort of upcoming winter of discontent, misery, I don't know what we're going to call it, in the post-sanctions environment. Obviously, Doom is focused on all sorts of bad scenarios, but what's your perspective? You've been an inflationista for a while. Did you expect the scale of inflation to happen as quickly as it's happening? I know you're not in the business of making forecasts necessarily as a historian, but you are scenario planning in Doom. And I was just interested in what your view on what's happening in Europe now in this coming winter is. Do we have any hope?
Well, you called me an inflationista. I guess I plead guilty. I did my doctoral dissertation on the German hyperinflation of the early 1920s. And so it's something that I've spent a lot of my career thinking about. I was, in common with a number of other people, premature in anticipating inflation in, when was it, around 2010, 11, because I think I didn't think through clearly enough the ways in which quantitative easing worked in the wake of the financial crisis. And one of the ways that it worked was that the banks accumulated excess reserves almost in lockstep with the expansion of the Fed balance sheet. There really wasn't, therefore, an inflationary consequence. So I got that wrong. But when the quite different circumstances of 2021 came along, then I think I called it correctly, along with Larry Summers and other economists. And the reason that it was different was that, apart from anything else, the banks didn't just accumulate excess reserves, and you had very rapid monetary expansion. Now, in 2020, that didn't matter because the velocity of circulation fell off a cliff because of the lockdowns and the disruption to economic activity. But what the Biden administration and the Fed got wrong in 2021 was that then, with the availability of effective vaccines, the economy was coming back to something resembling normality. And they unquestionably caused an overheating to happen on both the fiscal and the monetary side. It's insane that the Fed retained an extremely easy money policy through 2021. As early as February, Larry Summers and I were talking about the inflationary danger, and this turned out to be bang on target. This was one of the biggest monetary policy and fiscal policy errors of post-war history. And in some ways, it's a bigger error than the one that was made in the late 60s that Alan Meltzer writes about in his History of the Federal Reserve. In the early 70s, you got a geopolitical shock on top of the monetary mistake. And we've had exactly the same experience this year, where the war in Ukraine has played the same role as the 1973 Arab-Israeli war. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has created a huge shock in food and energy markets. That is building on top of the existing inflationary impulse from fiscal and monetary policy. And here we are, being persuaded or not persuaded by the Federal Reserve that magically inflation will come back down to 2% within a couple of years, after they have barely moved rates up in a meaningful way, given that real rates are still deeply negative. So this I got right, and Paul Krugman got wrong. And that's good, because Krugman was extremely unpleasant in the debates of 2010 and 2011 and revealed himself to be a very unscrupulous debater, resorting to all kinds of ad hominem attacks and personal abuse. So it's great to see him eating crow the other day. That was one of the highlights of my year so far.
But he has won one of the Pulitzer Prize, Neil, so he is more credible than you. Or not a Pulitzer, a Nobel Prize, right?
I'm sure he'll win a Nobel Prize and a Pulitzer Prize too. But prizes tell you nothing these days,
True.
other than that your friends are on the committees.
You call Larry Summers that I don't remember exactly what the phrase was, but the most Keynes-like, I think, economist since Keynes or something. I don't remember what exactly your description in the book was.
Because
it was
he's
very
so worldly. I mean, Keynes was a very worldly person who loved being in politics, being in government, and so does Larry. And that's why I think his instincts were very good last year. He just has a better feel for a policy error when he sees one happening than someone like Krugman, who's never really been a serious person in government.
I think we lost the last bit of that. But I was just going to ask, do you think the inflation debate circa 2021, when we were in that great sort of, is it transitory, is it not transitory? Do you think it was affected by sort of cancel culture and what is happening in terms of what some people perceive is happening in terms of free speech and the stifling of debate online? Because my perception is that I do think there was a bit of stigma associated with those calling the situation as potentially inflationary. I think Larry Summers was very much on the sharp end of a lot of abuse. Not abuse, maybe. I mean, I'm sure he can handle it, but I did perceive there was a kind of stigma, I think, with...
He was the first victim of cancel culture.
I mean, to some degree, I think he has. Do you perceive that as having influenced the inflation debate and maybe had an inadvertent effect on people sort of stubbornly clinging to the idea that it is just transitory? And is this like the real world repercussions of the culture wars as a result? I mean, is this one of the first? I'm wittering now, but I think you get my question.
I think probably not, because cancel culture's nearly always about sex, gender, race. It's not about CPI or PCE inflation measures. Economics used to be, and still to some extent is, a pretty hardball academic culture, but nobody played harder than Larry. Remember, Larry Summers opened a paper back in the day with the lines, quote, "There are idiots, look around." That was the opening of the paper. Now, to give Larry his due, he remains one of the thickest skinned people I know, who's almost magnificently oblivious to the impact his words are having on the people around him. And so I'm sure Larry didn't give a damn or pay the slightest bit of attention to all the snark that came his way back in February, mostly from his fellow Democrats who felt that he had somehow betrayed the cause. And he's, of course, enjoying the victory lap, having been entirely vindicated by the path of inflation. But I don't think this is really much to do with cancel culture, although you're right, Josh. I mean, Larry was one of the earliest victims. He was overthrown as president of Harvard for things that he said about the performance of women in STEM subjects. That was where that all began.
Did he even know he was president of Harvard? I get the sense that Larry Summers kind of just goes through his day. People like install him in positions, and he just like continues being Larry Summers. Like, hey, now you work for Obama's administration. He's like, oh, okay. How about we dump a bunch of pollution on India?
I think one of the things I admire about Larry is that he says what he thinks, regardless of context and the position that he occupies. And I've seen him treat a former president of the United States like a dumb graduate student in a relatively public setting. I thought that was great. So no, I mean, I think cancel culture tends to go after very different targets, and it'll never go after Larry on economics. It'll go after him on some politically incorrect thing he inadvertently said while trying to make an economic argument. And in the same way that the real casualties of recent years in academia, say Joshua Katz at Princeton or Roland Fryer at Harvard, were were not actually attacked for their work, even although their work or things that they had said had upset people on the progressive left. They were attacked for other things, or accused of harassment or violating some social code or other, because that's the way cancel culture works. It doesn't really go after arguments. And I learned that slowly over the last 20 years, that what happens with cancel culture is that you've said something that they disagree with, but because they don't believe in argument, there's never an argument. Nobody ever sits down and says, well, Neil, your book on the British Empire said that there were benefits as well as costs of British imperialism. I want to disagree with you because the costs were these and they far exceeded the benefits. I've never had that debate with anybody on the left at any point, but I have frequently been attacked for having made the argument. And that's one of the frustrating things about cancel culture. It's intellectually dishonest because it doesn't really engage. It just basically tries to smear. That was what I objected to about Krugman's behavior in the last great inflation debate. He wasn't actually engaged in anything other than hurling abuse at the people who disagreed with him.
I think you're right. It's very disappointing when people resort to ad hominem. Although I don't know how much more time you have for us, because we've got about 10 minutes, and I did want to get into your views on crypto. And I think the inflation pivot is a good one, because I think, at least as a journalist writing about economics and finance, I think sometimes the inflation angle has been maybe there's been a certain sort of gold buggism stroke crypto perspective on the whole inflation debate. And that means if you're a serious person, if you side with the inflation argument, people kind of brand you as, oh, you must be of that school. And then the conversation is closed down. So I think maybe it's more my perception that there is, as a result, a trepidation about calling out inflation if you're a sort of middle ground person who's supposed to be looking at these things objectively. But I'm just interested, like, how do you you told me once that you got into, or not got into, I don't think you're a Bitcoiner like Josh is, but you have found it an interesting development in the sphere of money. Are you going to be looking at the whole crypto journey from a historical perspective one day? What's your view at the moment, given the crash as well? Have you changed your views? Are you still curious about it?
Well, I wrote about Bitcoin and Ethereum and cryptocurrency generally in an updated version of The Ascent of Money that came out in 2018 with 2 new chapters. And what I argued then was that you had to understand the future trajectory in terms of adoption. And if Bitcoin was adopted by more and more investors as an option on digital gold, which is the definition I like, then its price would likely go up. And the argument I made was that if every millionaire in the world put 0.2% of his or her wealth into Bitcoin, the price would be about $15,000. And if they upped that to 1%, then the price would be somewhere in the region of $70,000. So that was my kind of range based on an adoption argument. It was never plausible to me that Bitcoin was an inflation hedge. And when anybody came to me with a crypto white paper saying, we have the solution to the problem of inflation, I would say, what problem? There hasn't been a problem with inflation for 20 years. In fact, the problem has been deflation. So why are you solving the problem of the 1970s? It's long gone. Gold isn't a particularly good hedge against inflation. So why would a kind of quasi digital gold be one? So I think the inflation argument was mistaken. And when people say, inflation's gone up, but Bitcoin's gone down, end of discussion, they're not understanding the point at all. I think the really critical story behind the crash was just leverage and massive amounts of margin trading as the usual influx of speculators occurred, as always occurs with any financial innovation. the real significance of the financial innovation is obvious. We clearly are not going to spend the rest of our lives paying for things online by typing in our credit card number on random websites. The system of payments is being transformed by technology. And I think there's no real doubt in my mind that blockchain-based systems are going to be a part of that revolution. I mean, financial technology, broadly defined, will not stand still. But in any period of financial innovation, and this was true when bonds were invented, it was true when stocks were invented, you get these huge speculative inflows. And as soon as there is a speculative moment, then the incentive is to get as leveraged as you possibly can and get as much exposure as you can on the way up. That's what happened last year. And at some point, what happens in those situations is that monetary conditions change, and then the most leveraged players blow up. And that's what we've seen happening since finally the Fed woke up to its inflation situation and started to tighten monetary policy. That doesn't mean Bitcoin's going to zero, which is still, I think, Nouriel Roubini's position. It's going through one of its periodic down moves, which will doubtless be followed by an upswing at some future date. The last thing I'll say is that decentralized finance is in some ways a more interesting proposition than Bitcoin itself. I think Bitcoin occupies this status of being an option on digital gold. It may or may not hold that status. It may turn out that we really do need digital gold. But the bigger question is whether you can transition to a system of smart contracts in which a lot of transactions effectively get automated and don't require the pages and pages and pages of paperwork that a typical mortgage these days requires. That's an exciting prospect, because ultimately, if you're telling me the financial system can't be improved, then I've got a bridge to sell you as well as my own tokens. It obviously can be improved. The existing banking system can be improved. The system of doing payments abroad can be improved. There's so much that can be improved by technology. It's unlikely in my mind that we somehow end up with all of decentralized finance, all of crypto disappearing, any more than all the dot-com companies disappeared after 1999.
I think that's interesting. I'm gonna
of CBDCs, though, in the context of crypto, kind of emerging out of crypto, but then potentially moving towards a demonetization if we get kind of contract-based money. Do you see that as a risk, or as a good thing, a positive thing, or a bad thing that we should be wary of?
Well, I'm instinctively skeptical about central bank digital currencies. The fact that the Chinese are really amongst the first to introduce one is in itself a red flag, pardon the pun. I'm not sure that we need a central bank digital currency. And I certainly don't like the idea of every American having an account at the Fed, though I don't think that would be quite how it would work out here. The problem is just that the reason that the Chinese Communist Party wants a central bank digital currency is A, because Alibaba and Tencent were getting too powerful in payments, and B, surveillance is really much easier if you have your own central bank digital currency, and every single transaction that every single citizen engages in can be logged and reviewed. We don't want that kind of a system in the United States. What I think we want is for financial innovation to happen in the United States. And as decentralized finance evolves, and it will continue to evolve, I think, very rapidly, it would be much better that it happened here. Do we want on and off ramps that take you to fiat? Well, you need them, because we'll still be paying our taxes in dollars, even if we have accumulated lots and lots of different crypto tokens. Should that on and off ramp be a state monopoly? Should there be a Fed stable coin? God forbid. I'd far rather that there were private sector solutions to the problem of how to have a good stable coin than that we created a state monopoly. So my sense is that let the Chinese do CCP surveillance money, and let's not try and copy that here. Let's allow the innovation to continue. And the big question, which I think hasn't been resolved, is what's the right regulatory framework for there to be innovation in decentralized finance? Is it possible to come up with something like Section 230 of CDA, which was so crucial in the commercial expansion of the internet, of Web 2, permissive, and yet a framework? I think one needs a permissive framework, but it can't be exactly the same, because when you get into money, obviously the opportunities for fraud and scamming are enormous. So there clearly has to be some regulatory framework. We I think, luckily, have abandoned the idea that we're just going to close it all down and have Fed dollar. That idea had a little kind of run back in 2021, but I think that's now dead and buried. The question is still unresolved. What's the right framework to allow this innovation to continue without a great many people being fleeced? We're still working on that.
And I'm gonna have to read those last chapters on the ascent of money because I have not read the updated version. But I'm curious as to why Ethereum is what you chose to write about. And the reason I ask that is, I'm sure you've heard the term Bitcoin maximalism.
Of course, I know some Bitcoin maxis.
Okay, so Bitcoin maximalism is a word that was invented by Vitalik many years ago after an argument he had with me. So
I did not know that.
Yeah, so this is a word that describes me in particular. So you're talking to the first Bitcoin maxi, one of two, me and my at that time podcast partner Chris DeRose. So I'm always curious as to what intrigues academics in particular about a system like Ethereum, and if they really understand how it works, or if it's just kind of like a curiosity because kind of the world looks at it and they just think, like, you know, they kind of index their views and say like, oh, I couldn't know whether this is in fact kind of BS or not.
Well, I'm probably structurally longer Bitcoin than Ether if I just look at my portfolio. But if you think about where decentralized finance is going, much more is going to be built on top of Ethereum than on top of Bitcoin. And in fact, just the layers are already much greater on the Ethereum platform than on Bitcoin. And Bitcoin, in a sense, it runs a risk of being an anachronism. That's the thing that would concern me if I was a Bitcoin maximalist, that it may not, in fact, be the future of money anymore.
That'll be interesting. I think you'll look back on this and be like, oh, I was really wrong in the future. But I'm curious. I kind of want to get those on record. And
on the Bitcoin maxi side,
I'm a maxi through and through for a lot of reasons.
I think I would personally, I mean, I try to be objective, and I have made a few concessions on my views on Bitcoin, but I would tend towards Bitcoin maximalism more than, say, decentralized finance. But I am, like, just to finishing things off, because I know you probably are very busy with Nancy landing in Taiwan, lots of things to digest. With respect to the future of crypto, do you think, now that we are in this energy scarcity world, does crypto still have a story? I mean, even with Ethereum, like promising proof of stake and some energy efficiency, there is no doubt in my mind that, you know, the system as a whole is far more energy intensive than, say, conventional. I mean, I don't know. We could have that debate with Nick Carter, for example. But how can we justify all that energy being burnt for crypto and speculation in the current environment? Do you think that is something that we will overcome in the longer run, or what do you think?
Well, I think that particular critique of crypto, and especially of Bitcoin, has been somewhat over-egged in the sense that a lot of the electricity that actually goes into mining is not being generated by burning coal at this point. In any case, there are two issues. One is can you move to a less energy intensive crypto? And I think that's very likely. The second is, can we move to a more efficient system of generating electricity? And that is certainly the case. The problem that we have at the moment is a structural one. Europeans and North Americans, to some extent, thought that they could go to a renewables-based energy system well before the technology was ready to do that. And by reducing investment in particularly natural gas and completely cutting off investment in nuclear, we've ensured that there's an energy crisis of our own making. It's not like Putin was able to do this on his own. We had to make ourselves heavily reliant in Europe on Russian gas and oil for him to have that leverage. If I look ahead to the lifetime of my children, I think most of the problems of generating clean energy are going to be solved technologically, including the battery storage problem. And solar is going to get much more efficient. It already has got much more efficient, and we'll rehabilitate nuclear energy because we'll have to. All of those things, I think, will take care of themselves, and therefore this won't be the decisive question for crypto. The decisive question for crypto is not, is it dirty? Does it generate greenhouse gases? The decisive question is, does it have a use case that meaningfully improves the different forms of activity that we associated with finance? Can it store your wealth in a better way than existing financial institutions? Is it better for transactions than existing financial institutions? All of those questions. That will decide the fate of Web3. Is it really a solution to the problems that undoubtedly exist? One scenario which is plausible is that in the end, we don't need blockchain-based payment systems. We are going to be content with AI-based and quite centralized payment systems of the sort that already flourished in China and are spreading rapidly around the world. So fintech could go down the road of centralization. In other words, Web3 could be just like Web2 and end up being highly centralized despite its promise of decentralization. That wouldn't surprise me, though it wouldn't be a good thing. And it might be that blockchain just ends up being a technology we use for storing health records or title deeds rather than using
Neil, you and I
have to transactions.
We have to do like a 1 hour show where we just talk about this, because I think I could convince you. I really want to. It's like convince one substantial academic that they are completely wrong about that perspective, and it would be important to me.
Well, remember, Josh, I mean, I'm actually the most constructive academic you'll meet.
I know that. That's why I don't ask Ken Rogoff. Ask Niall Ferguson.
No, but the economists have set their faces largely against this. What I'm doing, because I know that you're a true believer, is expressing some of the doubts that I think any rational person must have about the future of finance. Nobody knows. Financial evolution is an extremely difficult thing to predict. And if you just ask the question, what does quantum computing do to Bitcoin? The answer is nothing good. So you got to recognize that there are risks to a technology that was devised as long ago as 2008. And I would be doing a disservice to your listeners if I didn't express my own doubts. As I said, I'm structurally long Bitcoin, but I have to ask myself the question, is that where I want to stay, knowing what I know now, and so thinking about the way financial evolution could go?
So I'm not that far from where you are. My perspective, though, would be something like either Bitcoin works or nothing works, and things like storing health records, storing any of this stuff. Like this is my critique of Ethereum could be boiled down to one simple sentence, which is that blockchains don't do that. And so that's the thing. Like there are things that blockchains do not do. So I think it'd be very interesting to like have a discussion about why I think that, what blockchains actually do, and why it's either Bitcoin or bust. I would love to have that as a topic one day. If you're ever willing to do that, that would be something I would, and I'll be very respectful.
We would love to have you back. And the whole purpose of this podcast really is to have two different perspectives, because that's the blind spot. That's the idea.
The wrong one and the right one.
And we don't just always agree. So I'm bad cop, he's good cop.
Don't be so hard on yourself.
But final question, given it is the Blind Spot podcast, what is the big blind spot, perhaps within the global elite at the moment? What would you say is the biggest blind spot?
Well, we're rerunning the Cold War, and yet we seem intent on including its most dangerous episode. Although I don't think the Cuban Missile Crisis is replaying right now in Taiwan, I think it could relatively soon. And the blind spot that I think most people have is in believing that the Cold War was bound to have a happy ending. actually, at the height of the crisis, a Soviet submarine commander gave the order to fire a nuclear-tipped torpedo at US naval vessels that were dropping depth charges. And the only reason that it didn't happen was that a superior officer happened to be on board the submarine and countermanded the submarine commander's order. We shouldn't run that experiment again because there is just no guarantee that it turns out equally well. So I think the blind spot that most people have is that they don't recognize that the probability of nuclear war is high and has risen, and it rises the more powers acquire nuclear weapons. This has become a little bit more fashionable to say because Putin reminded us that he has the largest stock of nuclear warheads in the world and can't therefore lose the war in Ukraine, because even if his army starts to unravel in the face of a Ukrainian counteroffensive next week, he can still threaten to nuke Lviv, and that's the end of the war. So I think that's still the blind spot. We have kind of forgotten the lessons of the Cold War. And I think it shows in the way that the Biden administration has thought about this issue, which is that it seems completely to have forgotten the elements of deterrence. It looks like the people in power in Washington actually haven't read the relevant literature on nuclear strategy, and that's a pretty big blind spot to have.
Right. What would the equivalent Cuban crisis be, like the El Salvadoran missile crisis, or like what would it look like in the modern
it's the
age?
Taiwan semiconductor crisis. The Taiwan semiconductor crisis is that the Chinese launch a successful invasion of Taiwan and take control of TSMC, which gives them control of the key producer of high-end semiconductors in the world. And the US tries to stop that, and the Chinese sink the aircraft carriers, and then it's nuclear or bust. I mean, in that scenario, either the US uses nuclear weapons or it cedes global supremacy to China. That could happen at some point in the next, I would say, 2 or 3 years, with reasonably high probability. The only thing that's holding the Chinese back is their own risk aversion, because invasions of islands are difficult. But their opportunity is there because the US has no credible strategy to defend Taiwan. And that's what's, as I said at the beginning of the discussion, that's what's odd about the Pelosi visit and all that the Biden administration says about Taiwan. We're bluffing. We are bluffing. And that's a very easy thing to do. Yeah, they must know that.
Well, on that sad note, thank you so much for your time today, and hopefully you will come back and have that one-to-one with Josh at some other point. But it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed, Isabella. And thank
great.
you, Josh. I'm a doubt maximalist, and if you don't have a lot of doubt in your mind, then you're overconfident, and then you'll cause World War III. Or just one of the other.
Well, Neil, I've read a lot of your books, and Doom itself, the one that you have just released, is for me it took a little while. It starts off a little slowly as you go through the history of pandemics, but there's so much in every one of your books to discuss. It would just be a pleasure at some point to take any one of them and just kind of go through things. So we had another 10 hours that we were planning on, but I guess you have to leave early, so we'll let you go.
I got some family stuff to attend to downstairs.
Jeff, unfortunately, is from the Joe Rogan school of 3-hour podcasts, whereas I'm trying to.
I do go as I go through books. I buy every book they mention. So I bought like the Daniel Defoe journal of everything and everything else. So I have all of those.
If you do that with my books, you're going to end up with needing a new house for all the extra books.
That's actually what I do, Neil. I'm on the Niall Ferguson house purchasing tour. Every time I go through one of your books, I get another 200-300 books, and I've had to buy 3 or 4 new bigger and bigger houses for this reason. So thank you very much.
Strategy. I think I prefer your real estate strategy to your Bitcoin strategy. I'm a real estate maximalist. Come to think of it.
You and the Chinese.
Yeah. Well, listen, thank you very much again.
All right.
I'm going to end the podcast now, but there we go.